Hey, Steven, good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on your show.
Of course, I've we were chatting for a few minutes here, and us podcast speakers, I guess we do these things called one sheets, right? We have these media sheets that go out to the shows that we're going to go on. It's like, here's the books, here's the podcasts we've been on, things like that. I was just telling Steven, like, you've got a variety of topics that just with our audience and with me personally, you've just been an expert in. How did you get on this path though originally? Because I don't think you like set out to be the unconditional power guy or the honesty guy or whatever. Like, how did that develop?
Well, it's interesting because ever since I was a little kid, I've always been upfront and honest.
Yeah,
You might think, oh, that's really nice. No, I was kind of weird. Here's what I
yeah,
mean. I would tell on myself to my parents. So like if I dented the coffee table, I would
yeah.
proactively tell them. My brother, my sister would be like, I've never seen the coffee table.
Right.
So, but I've always had that as a nature and a way of being. And then so as I progressed and whatever, and then there was a time when I was an agent for film and radio and photographers and illustrators and whatnot, and I had a business partner, and it was going well, but I then my heart was not really in that. But I started to do seminars for photographers and teaching them about communication and motivation. So that's how I got into the business. Then my partner wanted the business, so I launched my, the speaking consulting business. And then as I was moving along, I was really focusing people on how to be upfront and honest. And but kind of to a lesser degree, not so overtly, just general communication. But then a friend of mine said, you should teach people exactly how to do that. And I'm like, it's kind of obvious. He goes, no, it's not. And I subsequently have learned that it isn't. And so the breakthrough for my business was when I created a 9-step formula on how to have an upfront, honest conversation such that the issue is resolved with anyone. It doesn't matter the personality. It doesn't matter the age. It doesn't matter any of those dynamics that we often think are important. It's based on the way the human mind thinks. So we can talk about that. But that was a big breakthrough. So I've always been honest. And then kind of the breakthrough was developing that formula. And then now it's led to teamwork and whatnot.
I think it's so important what you're saying because I've heard you say this. I'm not trying to steal your saying, but I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. But you said, it's not so much about what we say; it's about what we don't say, right? And it's that in and of itself, especially when you're in a leadership position, is the same as lying. Like when you're not being honest with the direct report. I was fortunate enough to have a mentor that told me like when you get to a point with somebody where disciplinary action is necessary, or they're getting put on a performance improvement plan or something like that. Like nothing should be a surprise, right? You get to write a review with somebody. It should just be recapping a conversation that you've been having over a course of weeks or months. So when I heard you talking about that, it really, I don't know, I really connected with it.
Absolutely. So one sign that we have a problem with somebody is when we're doing that performance evaluation or whatever, if we're nervous.
Yes.
And I would say, well, if you're nervous, why?
Right.
Because if you've had that upfront conversation, it should be a matter of fact of, like I said, this is an issue and this is what we need to do. But the reason why it's an issue is because people tend to avoid having difficult conversations. And what's really interesting is this has become more of a problem, not less of a problem. And the reason is because there's so much litigation, so much accusations, and people can say all kinds of things that I've worked with a lot of leaders where they're very nervous. How do I have that conversation and go well? So they do the worst thing of all, which is they don't have the conversation.
Right.
Sometimes they'll say, but I have. Like, I'll say,
Yeah.
well, tell me what you said. And they'll tell me, and I'm like, you didn't say to the person, you're not doing the job I need you to do. And here's what we need to do moving forward. You didn't have the fact-based conversation. You just talked in generality, like, it would be nice if we communicated better, or if you can get back to the customer better. We have to improve customer service. Instead of being, look, we've received 5 complaints from the customer around you, and I want to work with you. I want to mentor you, but this has got to get changed within the next month. At
Right.
least the person knows this. I'll share with you one other thing, and I because you've touched on such an important point where poor performers receive poor feedback. And the proof I have on this is I was hired by an agency, a government agency, but it doesn't really matter, to work with people who did not get promoted. That was the
Okay.
assignment, to coach them. 100% of the time, my first call was with them. Do you know why you did not get the promotion? And they didn't know. They got generalities like, again, communication, better response, whatever. And so I had to coach them on how to have an upfront conversation with the key people and get them to tell you the truth, even if it's off the record, so I can coach you. So it's really important. And people even miss this even in their personal life. People
Right.
just don't tell people what the feedback is. And so, I mean, how often have you said, I had no idea? But if they
Right.
had told me, I could have done something about it. So it's a really important point.
In that assignment that you were on, that government assignment, were you saying it was to the person that got passed over, and you were telling them to be proactive? Like when leadership's not
Yeah.
being proactive, you should go ask, right?
Yeah, and part of the thing is you can get people to say the truth through many strategies that which we can go through that. There's like 7 critical ones, but one of the most important things that gets people to speak the truth is make them feel safe.
Right.
So if we're having a conversation, but you're nervous, I'm going to take the feedback and maybe distort it or do something, you're going to be very hesitant. But if I created an environment where you feel very comfortable that I'm not going to misuse the data, that I'm really committed to growing and
Right.
ask you questions and you feel safe, you're more likely to speak up. In fact, this is my other beef. It's not psychological safety, it's emotional safety that moves the needle. You can know conceptually it's okay, but you have to feel safe. So one of the reasons why people don't feel safe is that they feel the information is going to be misused. Or have you ever had somebody say to you, look, I love feedback. And you give them feedback and they get defensive or they
Right.
debate you. Well, that's not true. And you're like, oh, forget it.
Right.
So it's important. So I had to coach them on how to have that conversation so that leader or those key people felt safe to bring up the really critical data. And there are ways along lines of what we talked about, which we can talk about even more. But it's critical to make people feel safe so they speak up.
That's a really good point. I don't hear people talking about the personal responsibility that we have in that, right? Like
Yeah,
if we're the subordinate, I guess, in for lack of a better term, in that relationship, it's like, hey, no, lay it on me. I want to improve. I value your
yeah,
opinions. Like, give them to me. The other thing, and I guess anyone that's been in leadership has probably had this happen before, but I remember I had a guy that was I mean, fantastic individual contributor. This guy was so good, and he wanted to be promoted. I knew he wanted to be promoted, but it was going to be to a traveling role. It was going to be, multi markets, and so someone else, and he's the one that told me I can't be considered for this. It's no, I like what I'm doing, and he was making great money. So no news is good news. That's shame on me, right? But I let the conversation die because he extracted himself from it, and we did have a pretty good relationship. You know, Year into this, after that passed, he quit, and a lot of times by the time someone quits, it's just too late, right? Like
tough. Yeah.
yeah, it's gone. The ship has sailed. And I was talking to me. I said, well, why are you leaving? Well, because I'm not getting considered to move into sales management. I said, I thought you were
Yeah.
out of that. I thought that, you were the one that like pulled, and yeah, but I still wanted to be considered. And I was like, okay, I've got to look at that as a leader and go, what could I have done differently? Why did I just drop the dialogue? This is a pretty young guy. It's not that he wanted to stay in the same job for the next 20 or 30 years. But at the same time, on his side, we're not mind readers, right? Like you've got to let
Right.
people know what you want and what feedback you need and where you're trying to go. And I think that combination, when it works, is awesome.
In fact, that's why we were saying earlier, poor performers receive poor feedback. Now, he's not a
Yeah.
poor performer, but it is really important what that person had taken responsibility. And then I also like where you're headed with this. The only person we can really control is ourselves.
Yeah.
So even my argument around, even if it's primarily their fault per se, is let's say we're in an argument with someone and they're 90% a cause of the matter. Now, I don't usually believe that's the case. I think it's not at all that way,
Right.
but let's just say they're mostly right. Even if we're 10% responsible, we can alter the trajectory of a conversation and an entire relationship. And my rationale and example for that is think about a train on a railroad track. At the time of the change, right, the switching on the track, it's a very minute change, but down the road, it's miles apart. That's an important part with a conversation. One conversation can send it a totally different trajectory. So, for example, what could you do in that situation? It is very tough, and that person does bears a lot of responsibility. But as a leader, what can we do? One thing is create that emotional safety so they feel that way. The other thing that is really, I'll give two other strategies that I think would help in this situation. Ask direct questions, which is, hey, are you completely okay then staying at that level? Now, the argument then being is, well, we can't ask a question we never thought to ask. But I often look at situations and say, what questions could I have asked? And the really critical part is asking direct questions. Direct questions get direct answers. Fuzzy questions get fuzzy answers. So, for example, if you said, are you okay with this? Sure, I'm okay. Are you okay to stay in the same role? That might provoke a different answer. And so I always look at things, and having worked with some of the best CEOs and admirals and generals for all these years, over 25 years in the business, I've come to believe the best ones always look at themselves and say, what could I do differently, no matter what's happening out there? How can I respond to the economy? How can I respond to the changing workforce? What can I do differently? So I love where you're headed with this. So I think asking direct questions. The other thing that's really important besides emotional safety is rewarding feedback. So sometimes people don't speak up. They feel safe, but the rationale is it's not going to make a difference.
Right.
So it's also important because if the person feels like, well, Ken, you're asking me, but there's no other opportunity, so I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to put pressure on you. Then they may not speak up. And so rewarding honesty means as soon as you get feedback, do something with it. So the person says, oh my gosh, they didn't do everything with my idea, but they're taking some ideas, they're moving forward, they're at least giving me feedback on that. So it's asking direct questions, providing emotional safety, and rewarding honesty. Rewarding honesty is often the missing element that can make it really turn into gold.
I love that. Even in what you're saying, what's funny is back when he told me that, um, I think when he said, I'm okay, like I can't do it, I was already on to the next thing in my brain. If I can remember, like as we're talking about, because I was like, I knew he wasn't going to do it. I got to move forward. I'm thinking of the next thing. I wasn't really thinking about it. I was thinking of who I was going to put in that job. Do you know what I mean? I was just making sure he didn't want it. He wasn't going to do it. Okay, you're not going to do it next. And I really didn't take the time to go, get granular with it. Okay, well, if not now, then when? What do you want to do next if it's not this, right? Are you going to be happy being in this role? Like you're saying, very direct questions, get direct answers. I love that. When you get into, you mentioned the 9-step formula to having honest conversations. And, I think I'm a little bit, I don't want to say I'm wired as well as you when it comes to this stuff, but it is in my nature to be like, well, yeah, let's communicate more. If anything, I want to err on the side of over communication, making sure my point's getting across, that they're being heard. And I think when it comes natural, like it did to you, that you're like, well, what do you mean? Just tell them. But what's the formula then? What's it? Because so many people do struggle with it. And I think there's a lot of leaders that I meet and I'm like, oh, that guy seems really sharp. That girl seems really sharp. Then you talk to their folks. And to me, you want to get any indicator of how someone's doing, just talk to their direct reports and listen to what they don't say, right? Listen to the missing pieces to the puzzle. But what did you uncover as you were talking to these guys and as you were trying to formulate this for people that didn't naturally think the way that you do?
So let me kind of answer this conception, then I'll get real specific.
Sure.
I've come to realize, and how I built the company is I take a very scientific engineering approach to human relationship problems. I believe there's formulas to fix virtually every human problem. And people might say, well, I don't agree. I'll say, well, I can give you formulas on all kinds of things, how to turn around complaining, how to create great teamwork. There's specific formulaic steps that, yes, you have to customize it to some degree, but there's a formula. So I uncovered a formula and it worked and saved marriages and got people promoted. So let me go through what this is.
Please.
I'll go through it very quickly and then we can go into in depth because there's a lot of different pieces. The first step is what you're talking about is actually deep listening. And what I mean by deep listening is not about just listening to the words, it's listening to the emotions and what people want. And so really listening, because what happens is when people have a difficult conversation, they tend to want to go into transmit mode instead of really probing, right? And even what you were sharing with that employee, it's very easy or I wouldn't say easy. It's very, we are pressured because of so time constraints to kind of move things too fast, but really take time to listen and deeply listen. So we can go back to that. The second one is taking ownership attitude. And that's important because if you ever had somebody have a conversation with you and they're being upfront, but they're blaming you, right? You didn't do this. And even if they're making good points, when people feel blamed, they disconnect. So we
Right.
have to take ownership of our attitude. Nobody is responsible for our attitude. We are. And that's important going into the conversation to not blame. Then there's 7 critical steps. And actually, then when you're executing the conversation, purpose, remember, begin with the objective. And that sounds simple, but people begin with the problem versus what the objective is. Second is share concerns. And concerns are the reasons why sometimes we're worried about, and outlining those and saying, look, I want to talk to you about this, about us working better together, but I'm a little bit concerned because I'm concerned you might take it the wrong way. It's not what I mean. I want to work with you, but outlining those concerns. Then the next step is being very fact-based with notice and imagine versus fact versus opinion. A lot of people share opinions and they don't share facts. Then the next step is making suggestions. And that's so, have you had somebody go into upfront conversation? They might do various things and you're like, okay, so what's your point? What do you want? And they go, well,
Right.
I don't know. I just
Right.
wanted you to know that.
Just
And
do
you're
it
like,
better.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you're like, so it's important when we're coming into a conversation to know what's our suggestions. And then the next step is coming from the other person and thinking of them in a persuasion type of benefit way. And then following up next step. And then always end on a conversation, no matter how difficult it is, with an appreciation. And the reason why appreciation is important is if you think about it, and this really astonishes a lot of people, we don't always remember how people begin a conversation, but we never forget how they left us in a conversation.
Mm.
The last words are always what we tend to remember. First, important, right? First impression, all that stuff. But we can, even presentation wise, whatever might screw things up. But if we end on a good point, that's what people will tend to remember. It's like going to a restaurant and the meal is great, but then the bill comes out late and the dessert is lousy. You're not going to say, well, it was a tremendous experience. You're like, ah. So when we end the conversation, that's critical to end it correctly and with an appreciation.
Yeah. In fact, when I'm talking to like people on my team and whether they did an intake call or whatever, I'll ask them, well, how did you end it?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
did it end? How did it
Yes.
wrap up? Right.
Yeah.
I know what the first 25 minutes of the 30 minutes probably looked like. What did the last 5 look like? You know what I mean? How did
Absolutely.
it end?
Even think about this, you're leading a meeting,
Yeah.
right? And so the meeting is contentious and debate. Okay, that's healthy. It's good to have debate. That's good, discussion. But if we don't leave on a good note, if let's say, so there's an argument with the team and we're airing things out and I say, well, okay, time to go. People are going to remember that. But if I simply say with a few minutes left, all right, we had a lot of discussion. What are some good things that happened out of this conversation? Well, we learned about each other's perspective. I have some ideas of what we could do to move forward. Then they're going to leave on a good note, and then they're more likely to want to have another meeting. So even whether it's a sales process, a conversation, or just life as a whole and friendships, watch how we end a conversation and how we leave them.
How did you deal with, you talked about, today's day and age, litigious environment, managers afraid to kind of, which I think is a bit of a cop out, even though it's a real thing, right?
Yeah,
And I'm afraid to talk to Susie because she'll
it
think
is.
whatever. And I know that's like a real thing that exists, but I also think you got to find a way to lead around that. What are you suggesting for people in environments that might be sort of, like that? Maybe a company's got a history of, God, every time you talk to an employee, they call the hotline or whatever. I mean, how do you get people to break through that and gain, I guess, the trust of I guess it comes back to what we're talking about here, which is hear them out and appreciate them. But with those extremely difficult environments that you've ran into lately, what are some things you've seen and suggestions you had for companies to work their way through it?
I love what you just said because I do think there's a lot of excuses and
Yeah.
conditions that may be legitimate, but we can work around that. And I've
Right.
met many people who have used that formula we just talked about. And if they want that, they can email us it's Steven at StevenGaffney.com, or just go to justbehonest.com and say they listen to it, and we'll send them that formula. But the reason why I'm saying this is I've never had anybody, at least that I know of, and I've taught that formula for maybe 20 years now. It's been many, many years. I've never had anybody have it go south. I've had it it depends on how effective they use the formula, but it never goes south because there's no blame in there and it's
Right.
fact-based. So to directly answer your question, the part they really need to focus on is making sure the conversation's fact-based, not so much opinion-based, which we can go through, and then leave them with a pathway forward. So for example, if I say, look, I notice I noticed we've received 3 complaints from other people about how things are going leading wise. We have to get this corrected. Let's talk about how we can move forward and how I could mentor or help you. That'll be great. Or look, I just want to acknowledge that, look, your sales are down by this percentage. It must turn around within the next 3 months or within the next month. And I'm committed to helping you, but we must create a plan, and then I'm going to hold you accountable to that plan. That's fine. See, what happens is where people feel misjudged is if it's a lot of opinions and not fact-based.
Right.
And so it's really the fact-based part. And we can send them more on that if they want. But anyway, think about fact-based and then solutions out of that entire formula. That's the one to really make sure. But that's what we should be doing anyway, because if we go to HR, let's say you work in an organization and there's a problem, they're going to say, what happened? What are the facts?
Right.
What did you say? What did they say? What were their actions? That type of thing. And so if we ground the conversation in fact-based, that's going to help tremendously. And my proof of even that is I've coached lawyers on a lot of stuff, and they may even fall for, well, I don't want people to misinterpret. And I'm like, fact-based, think about your training. So I've worked and helped a lot of lawyers think through things and stuff like that as well. Fact-based, and then come up with solutions.
I think it's God, when we're talking about it, because we're not in the heat of the moment, right? And it really is simple though to say, like, look, this is what was expected. This is where you stand. This is what you need to do to make it better. This is how I can help you to make it better. This is how we're going to hold you accountable to making it better. And then I think ending the conversation, I think this is very important. And that is, if someone feels attacked, even with facts, like if you scare them, if you back them into a corner, maybe the next call is to your superior or to HR or to whoever, because they're like, this guy just wants me out, right? If you don't wrap it up, like you were saying earlier with, hey, I know this is tough to hear. I know that you're behind on your numbers. We got to have this conversation. The reason that we're having this conversation is I genuinely care about your success and I want to see you here. And I know you're going to be here because I know we're going to get this done, right? Something
Absolutely.
like that. But I think if you don't end it with that, it's just like all this stuff coming at you. You're afraid of losing your job. And what can you do in desperation to save it?
Absolutely. And, here's the thing is, I remember years ago, I had a client of mine who was one of the top executives, and she had somebody launch a complaint about her. And so she and I then started talking. And I said to her, are you worried? And she said, no. And I said, why? And she said, because I do the right thing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, because there are some people that are going to try to game the system and whatnot. The thing is, fear is not something to be ignored. It's looked at. So if you're afraid to have the conversation, it's not don't have it. It's why am I afraid? And then get coaching so that you can go into being powerful. Because I work with a lot of leaders and I always say to them, you cannot manage in fear.
Right.
It's important to acknowledge the fear and then resolve it. But if you're going to have a conversation and you're fearful, you'll be tentative. You won't share what needs to happen. You're not going to be as hopeful and as optimistic as you can. You're going to be very cautious. And so I worked with a lot of leaders who they sometimes won't even share the difficult news to the workforce because they're worried that, let's not talk about legal now, let's just say in general, they're worried about demoralizing the workforce. And I always say to people, look, people will weather the storm as long as they know there's a bright future.
Right.
And so it is really critical to be like, okay, we're having some challenges. We just went through some layoffs, whatever it is, but then give them hope and be really clear on here's the pathway forward. So even on a bigger scale, just as a whole, we want to do what we're talking about. We're talking about, so in a smaller conversation, but also in a larger conversation,
Yeah.
and even in a town hall and those all hands types of meetings.
Well, I think people and contest this or jump in or add to it or whatever you want to do, but I do feel like people are wired without information to fill in the blanks with negative information.
Yeah.
Most people. So when it's like, well, okay, I heard rumblings of this and that, and Steven's not saying anything, Ken's not saying anything, whatever. And so it's got to be bad, right? It's just got to be bad. We're getting laid off. They're going to shut down our location. They're going to, and
right.
In the meantime, maybe the real situation was something totally different, something much smaller, something that could have been addressed. But I feel like people do that all the time. I feel like they'll do it with their own performance. Someone could be above performance standards, but no one's actually kind of checked them in and compared their stats to their goals and to their quotas. And again, no news in their mind isn't good news. No news is scary. And I don't know why we're wired that way exactly, but I think most people are.
Yeah, left to absence, people will fill in the vacuum.
Yeah.
And so I always say, never let your silence do the talking. Never, ever let your silence do the talking.
Right.
And in fact, what we really look at, let's go back to difficult conversations and communication as a whole. It's not what people say, it's what they don't say. And I've had many people challenge me on this. And I remember one time I was doing a session and this lady said, that's not true. And I said, okay, what happened? She goes, I gave this person feedback, a coworker, and he got very defensive. So you're saying getting the unsaid said, and I'm now left with a bad situation. And I said, well, what happened? I mean, for one thing, she wasn't very clear on the facts, but I said to her, why did you even have the conversation? Why? And she said, well, I care about him. I care about what we're doing. I want this all to work out, and I'm trying to work together better with him. And I said, did you say all of that? And of course she said no. And I said, I want to contend what tripped you up, even wasn't even all that opinions and stuff, is really what you didn't say.
Yeah.
It's what we leave out. People forget to say, I mean, think about it this way, even in interpersonal relationships, we can be mad at somebody and still love them, but somehow when we're mad, we don't say the other part. What about saying, look, I'm mad and I really care about you? That's maybe in the personal side, but just even in workplace, look, this has got to get changed and I'm trying to make this work together. So what I want to contend with, if people had to remember one thing out of what we're talking about, hopefully it's many things, but one thing in particular, it's not what we say, it's what we're not saying.
Yeah.
That trips people up. And people don't want to be surprised and blindsided. Executives hate that. That's why we've developed all these methods and work with them on their culture to get the unsaid said, because they don't like it. You don't like it, I don't like it. Nobody likes getting surprised.
Right.
Why didn't they just tell me? Even back to that employee a while back, if they said, look, hey, I was thinking, Ken, I know I said this a while back, about not getting promoted, but I've thought about it and I want a future here, and got that unsaid said, he would have been, oh my gosh, let me see what I can do. Because it's really what people don't say that is really the important, that is the critical problem. And my proof on that is there was research done by Dr. Will Schutz. This is in a book he wrote some years back, but it's still relevant, is that 8 out of every 10 problems are sourced back to lack of open, honest communication. 8 out of every 10. So that means 8 out of every 10 problems we're faced with at work probably could have been fixed if we got that unsaid said. So it's so important to do this.
That's crazy. That is crazy. I think that 80% of the breakdowns are 80% are 100% preventable, right? I mean, with a proactive approach. I'm thinking about another mentor I had, but how a lot of times if we're working for someone else, leaders working at a big corporation, it could be any level unless you're, chairman of the board, right? It could be any level where, hey, this sales rep isn't doing their job or this director's not doing their job if you're a VP or whatever. And that's usually, I feel like, how executives phrase stuff in the corporate world. When their boss comes into town and you want to make a team change, you'll go, Ken's not cutting it. Here's all the bad shit about Ken, right? Cancer on the team. hasn't made his quota for 4 quarters. I had a boss that I told him that once. We had somebody that was underperforming. Wasn't a good team fit. All of which may have been true. But the lesson I learned that day was huge because he said, "Oh, okay. Can you do me a favor and grab his personnel file?" And I was like, "Why do you want that?" And he's like, "Just get it." And I'm like, "Okay." I was pretty junior at the time, right? So I go get the personnel file, and he's like, "Okay, a performance review 5 months ago. This guy almost looks like he should have been promoted off that performance review, and there's zero paper trail in between now and then. Not that you're going to write someone up every time you have a conversation, right, but there could be manager's notes in the file that said, we had a conversation. We talked about the need. Sometimes if it's formal or it's a performance improvement thing, yeah, you want to have that documented. But other times it could just be a note. Hey, we followed up, progress check, this or that. But there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. And he said, I'm not really disputing because I don't know either way. There's no facts in here to even tell us. But what I do know as a fact is we haven't done our job. And I'm like, God, yeah. I mean, he was so right. And that just stuck with me. I ended up using it where either way, someone, even on the positive side, someone's ready to be promoted. Great. Let's build that case. We want to promote people. We're growing. Why? Why are they more worthy than other people? Because you say so, or is there like and not just numbers, but what about the other stuff? What about the cultural fit? What about the aptitude, right? And yeah, it was just such a good lesson to be like that. Paper trail should accompany what our opinions are, And I don't like calling it a paper trail because I'm making it sound too formal. And I know these are conversations, but you know what I mean? The feedback given to the person was in direct contradiction to what was given to us about getting him off the team, Yeah,
and just think about how often you and we get surprised and by feedback I wish I would have known. What I've come to realize is there is a minority of people who don't want feedback, but the majority, no matter what level, is craving for feedback.
Yeah.
They want to know how can they improve. And actually, here's what's really fascinating. The higher achiever, the more they crave that feedback because they're competitive. They want to get better.
Yeah.
And so it's so feedback is so important. So it doesn't always have to be the negative. It could be the positive, because I've also seen it where people don't appreciate their great employees. They don't say enough good stuff. And if you think about it, it's because a lot of leaders and managers were focused on fixing problems. And so when somebody's doing a great job, we almost sometimes leave them alone.
Yeah, you're like, not a problem. Yeah.
But we don't nurture them. And really even appreciate them as well. And I don't mean we have to throw them a big party, but hey, how about saying, it was a great job on that report? In the book, Unconditional Power, the new book that we launched in September, there's a whole chapter on appreciation, but around critical elements and being specific with it, so it's not generic.
Yeah.
And then being results oriented. It's a lot different if I say, hey, great job, Ken, on what you did, or if I said, great job on what you did with that report that actually won us a new client. So that's results oriented and specific. It's going to mean more. And so that's really, all this stuff is really important. And so that's one thing. And then I want to talk about something else related to making moves. So if we are doing the right things, I've also seen it where people are still hesitant to pull the trigger and make a personnel move. So I'll share with you my record. I've been at this over 25 years, and I've never, ever, ever had a leader say to me when they make a personnel move, I should have given that person more time. Should have given them more time.
Right.
It's always, I waited too long. And the second thing, it always happens 100% of the time, it's worse than I thought. And the reason why it's worse than I thought, because it's like lifting up a rock and you see all the other problems that people were just kind of dealing with, and now it's getting exposed. Right. So if we do the right things and we're gun shy to kind of make that move, you really got to ask yourself why, because we're not doing anybody else a service. Even that person who's not doing a great job, maybe there's a different role for them or something, but just letting this linger on can bring down a whole team too. So those two things I've always seen, and I remind people, so when you're really making thinking to make that personnel move, you probably should move on it pretty quickly, because you're probably already waiting too long.
Yeah, and usually that person's already taking up the part of your brain that can handle personnel issues, they're taking up 80% of it. You know what I mean? You're just thinking about it all the time until they're gone. So it's not worth it.
I know I'm interrupting, but Les Brown has a great quote. He said, we allow people to live rent free in our
Yeah, I've
mind.
heard that one. I love it. Yeah.
And some of us allow people to build condominiums up there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
It
true though. And
occupies us, you know?
so
So,
I have this thing now. If someone does get in my head like that for a while, I'll go, okay, what is this? How long do I want them to live rent
yeah.
free? And have I been fair? Have I done all the things I need to do, to make sure that if they're going to stay here, they can stay here? Because the other part of this too, we've somehow gotten onto the bad performers, but we can switch out of it. But the other part about this too is I've never sat with a person and said, I think you have the ability to turn this around. I am here. I'm rooting for. I have never said that and not meant it. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
always want someone to save themselves. I mean, God, the idea of starting over and putting a new. I mean, and some of the best people I know, including myself. Not that I'm one of the best people I know, but we've had our head on the map before. We've
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and we've gotten up, and so some of those people end up being some of your very, very, very best performers because they can tell the story to the underachiever or to the person who's struggling. I was there, man. I was right where you are.
Yeah.
I had this exact, kind of issue around closing sales or whatever it was. And here I am. So, you've got a couple of choices. It makes them so much more credible, I think, as a leader.
Somebody once said, let other people borrow your eyes until they can see it for themselves.
Ooh,
Let
that's
other
a good
people
one.
borrow your eyes until they can see it for themselves. In other words, great leaders like have that vision. And sometimes we have to instill confidence in people, even when they might be down.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to say, I believe in you. And I'm 100% with you too, Ken, because anybody can change. So
Yeah.
I work with a lot of people sometimes where they'll say, well, people don't change. And I'm like, are you the same person you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Hopefully, I'm always improving as a human being and getting better. And so, whether we call it changing or evolving, but however it is, we can change if we really want to. So, I really do believe, for example, in sales, anybody could be a great salesperson. It might, some people might come much more naturally, but if they really want to change, they can do that. Anybody can be a great leader. We've come up with 10 traits on what's really critical to have people want to follow you. And one of them is around deep listening, what we talked about. But another one is being optimistic and passionate about the future.
Mm.
And I work with a lot of leaders who are not the best in that category. And if you up that category, you can really inspire people. So anyway, my point in bringing this up is I really do believe that anybody can change. And I can think for myself. Do we have time for a quick story of how
Oh,
I
of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
So about a year into me speaking, I was talking about honest communication. And as I mentioned earlier, and I was getting rolling and I had some really easy home runs and I got way overconfident. And so I remember doing this session and I like go in, there was a 2 hour session at that time. And I was so bad that half the people walked out. They didn't wait for me to turn my back to the flip chart I was working on. They just left. And when I was done, I was crushed because obviously it was me. And it's always interesting people's reaction, when you have friends and stuff. Some of my peers, at the time, they said, oh, well, sometimes things can happen. And I'm like, no, I know it's me.
Right.
And then I went through depression. I was like, I'm awful. What am I doing in this? Yeah, it's some beginner luck. And then after got through feeling sorry for myself, I realized, okay, what went wrong? And I had no idea how to manage a group dynamics. I really didn't know exactly what I was doing. I had some basic principles, but I hadn't broken them down. So I studied group dynamics and I studied what I was doing. And I really came up, that helped me launch, later on down the road, this formula. And the next presentation, I was light years ahead of where I
Right.
would have. And then many times I could tell you how I messed up on MSNBC. I was interviewed there and I came back to the office and I said to my assistant at the time, how'd I do? And I thought I did great. She goes, it was awful. And I was like crushed again. And then I realized, I got to learn better on how to do television and whatnot. And, you learn these things. So I have really messed up sometimes.
Yeah.
And, you just grow in life. So no matter where somebody is at listening to this podcast, whether something's bad happening to them in business or even in their personal life, a divorce or some really bad situation, there's always strategies about what to do moving forward if you're committed to changing and growing.
But I think the biggest power that we have is, like you're saying, is to allow someone to see the world through your eyes until they can see through themselves. And
Yeah.
so, because it's also like you're being humble, you're being vulnerable. It's kind of funny now that it's over, but you're also showing that it's okay, right? Like, and I don't know why, but so many leaders seem to protect and guard their failures, like they haven't
I
had
agree.
them. And I don't get it. Like, what are your insights on that? I mean, it could be lots of things, I guess, insecurity, inexperience, but I've seen it at all levels. This isn't just entry level salespeople. Sometimes guys in the big chairs just, never let them see you sweat kind of thing. And it's like, no, always let them see you sweat. I mean, guys like you are probably making 100 different decisions a day. If you're getting 80 of those right, you're hitting the ball out of the park, which means you screwed up 20 times or at least didn't make the perfect pick. And it's in the ownership, I think, of those 20 that's going to make you endeared and connected to your folks.
Is vulnerability, and I'm
Yeah.
completely with you. So earlier we talked about like 7 strategies to get the unsaid said. Another strategy is show vulnerability. So vulnerability inspires honesty. I'll say that again. Vulnerability inspires honesty. In other words, if I'm vulnerable and I share my mistakes, it creates an environment where people are more likely to share their mistakes. If
Yeah.
I come across like I got all the answers, people are going to be or could be intimidated, or at least not willing to share their vulnerability. So I always coach leaders to be vulnerable first, because you can inspire other people to really
Mhm.
speak the truth. So the way I end up doing this for like a strategy is we do a lot of stuff with leadership teams and making them consistently high achieving teams. And in the morning of the first day when we're together, we give them a list of questions to answer. But what this does is show the human side. So an example would be, what are the 3 pivot moments or events that have happened to you in your life, and how did they define you? And those pivot moments or situations are usually challenges where people, like how they grew up or they got fired or something, and then how it grew as an individual. Once they share questions like that, and there's some other ones, but once they share questions like that, the room changes.
Yeah.
Instantly, guards go down, and then it ends up being an entirely different conversation. And we're able to get that team, if it's already high achieving, even higher achieving, and if it's not doing well, just moving it up. So either going from medium to high achieving or high achieving to excelling, and by creating that vulnerability. So it's important to do that. So what's the takeaway is for us to be vulnerable first
Yep.
and sharing mistakes, and then you can share what you learn from it. And that can create the environment where people get the unsaid said, and the whole environment and culture will improve.
Ah, that's so good. That's so good. Can I hit you on one quick subject before we
Sure.
wrap up?
Yeah.
This is going to be selfish because, again, I'm just looking at all the things that you're an expert in, and I'm like, I'd like to talk a little bit about innovating daily in any environment. How do you create that culture or that environment of
So the
innovation?
first thing, well, the first thing is to realize how important innovation is. And so I'm not talking about innovating a new product or service. I mean, that's a whole nother subject, which we could look at, but that's a whole nother thing. I'm talking about daily innovation
Right.
and the willingness to say, okay, if it's going well, how could I improve it? Or if it's not going well, what am I going to do to change it? And sometimes people fall in these traps where they say, well, what's wrong with the way we did it before? It was working, or it is working. And my answer is, if we are not progressing, we are regressing. There
Hmm.
is no such thing as status quo. So the whole idea is to be innovative daily. Well, there's 13 barriers that I've come up with and I've realized at working with organizations where it's a barrier to daily innovation. An example of this, and we can go through a lot of them, is organizational folklore. Organizational folklore, that's the way we've done it, or we tried that and it didn't work. Well, that's very often not the case, especially if we go into the facts of the situation. An example of that is I was doing a session and for a company, and and a person said, "Well, you can't speak the truth in our company because supposedly you get fired." And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well, I don't know the details." I said, "Well, why don't you know the details?" And he always said, "Ken, I wasn't there." I said, that's very telling. He's operating, if I speak the truth, I could be fired. And he was never there to even witness the situation. But here's what's really fascinating about the story. there was somebody else who had been in with the company for a long time. And there were other people as well who said, well, give us something. Where did you hear that? Or what were anything you heard? They traced it all the way back to this individual who was fired, but he was fired for poor performance. And, as we know, we can't always, as leaders, we talk about getting the unsaid stuff, but there's certain things that we are not allowed to share. But people can leave the organization and share all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so the takeaway is we have to poke at organizational folklore. And I'll give you one other example that's relevant to all leaders. I had a client of mine who took over a group that was a team, organization about 9,000 people. It was a substantial organization. And he had to change the culture real quickly and change the whole product because it wasn't doing well. And he came out with a lot of ideas, and people said, well, you can't do that. And he said, okay, tell me where it says I can't do that. Virtually half the people never came back because it never said that. Some people did come back and would point to a policy, and he said, okay, well, let's read it together because I want to learn. And of course, it never said you can't.
Right.
If you work with the federal government, and so often there are people who say, well, you can't do that. And the great leaders that I work with in the federal government let's figure out a way on how to do this legally and ethically. So my point in bringing this up is there's almost always a way, and we have to poke at organizational folklore.
Right.
That's an example of one of the barriers. Another one would be time. People say, I don't have time. But the reality is, if it's important enough, we will make the time. So if you take your whole job and put it in an innovative mindset, that can make a world of difference. And I can talk to you more about that. But there's a lot of different barriers. We have to look at those barriers. And if they want that, because I know we're only in this podcast and we might be short on time, if they email us, we'll send them an article that details these 13 barriers.
That's
and
awesome.
Also even a little poster they can put out about these 13 barriers, and they can talk about that to make sure those barriers are removed so they can be innovative daily.
Yeah, it's crazy how in most companies, policies and procedures have become, and not lately, I mean, this has gone on forever, but it's like, that's the red tape. That's the thing that's preventing you. When in reality, the whole idea of even setting up a policy is we figured out for now being the key thing, a really cool way of doing something so we don't have to rethink it every single time. But the key thing being for now, right? And when it doesn't work, write an exception, challenge it, talk about it, right? But people get so locked in. But again, that's part of leadership's responsibility, is to create a culture and an environment that welcomes innovation, that welcomes feedback, that allows you to be heard, that makes you not be afraid for your job. I mean, listen, it sounds like leadership in the example that you gave got a bad rap on some guy that left like years ago. But had they been more progressive, maybe they would have been poking at the folklore to figure that out, where it didn't take months and years of people being in silence out of fear,
Absolutely. We have to pay attention to rumors, and
Yeah.
it's not to give them credit, it's actually to debunk things.
Yeah.
So I had another client that would take a part of their meeting and discuss about rumors that he had heard, and also opened it up and said, look, I'm very transparent. Ask me about any of these questions.
Right.
So it is true. The challenge is that we just don't even poke at organizational folklore. I've seen leaders take things for granted. For example, we tried that and it didn't work. Well, what exactly happened? Because rarely did they do it exactly the same way. And here's my rationale. Even if they did do it exactly, like you have an idea and people say, we tried that and it didn't work. Let's say they did try it earlier and it didn't work. Well, times are changed. I mean, we live in a great AI generative world. I mean, as we were talking about even before the podcast, there's a lot of things changing and dynamics that are changing. So maybe it would work now, or maybe with a few tweaks. But we can't be afraid of not poking at organizational folklore.
Yeah.
It's so important. Another barrier is the kind of not invented here. Oh, that doesn't apply to us. Instead of looking at how it could apply to us. I mean, look at what SpaceX has outsmarted Boeing. It's like SpaceX has had, 15 successful launches? Boeing is still trying to, at least to date, get their astronauts back at home. I'm not trying to be overly critical of Boeing, but SpaceX is looking at whether people like Elon Musk or not, you got to hand it, that guy's willing to challenge the existing system and look at things differently.
Right.
And so the idea of this not invented here or doesn't apply, well, what could we learn from SpaceX that could apply to our business? We're not launching people in space necessarily, our businesses, but what are the lessons learned? How does Elon Musk build a team? What could we take from that? And I don't mean you take everything, but again, looking at this, or here's another way. Um, you're looking at your company and all right, we're down in this area. Well, is there another area in the company that's doing it well? What could we learn from them? And will they have a different market segment, or they have a different customer? Okay, but still, what could we learn from them? So I've learned questions really make a huge difference. So if I say, why won't it work? That's what's going to happen. But if I say, how could it work? What could we take away? It'll make a difference. And it's even how we filter in our mind. Can I share this one little quick story?
Please. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
is the latest work I've been working on is how the mind filters has a lot to do with our success. So I have a friend of mine that he filters everything from what I know. Oh yeah, I know that. I knew that. I knew that. And I said to him one day, I'm a really good friend of his, and we challenge each other. And I said, look, you filter everything from reading books and everything from what you know. Successful people who are continuing to grow, and you are successful, but looking at the next level, look not at what they confirm to know, but what they don't know. So when you're watching a movie, when you're reading a book, when you're interacting with people, are you filtering from what you do know, or are you filtering of what you don't know? I've learned by working with some of the best CEOs, admirals, and generals. Again, some of these people are responsible to billions and billions of dollars. They don't look for confirmation. They look for what can they learn. They
Right.
watch videos, they read books, and they move fast through the stuff they know, but are always focused. Well, what don't I know? I have clients who will call me on the phone and they'll say, tell me what the latest is out in the industry. What are you hearing? They're craving for what they don't know and what they
Right.
can learn. So even the way the mind filters, are we filtering from what we don't know or what we do know? Here's another one. Are we filtering from we're always right? Or are we filtering for how we could be wrong? Some people just look for all the evidence that they're right. Some constantly looking at, maybe I could be wrong. Not so I'm insecure, but what are the facts? Maybe I need to go ask that customer, that employee, or that leader, or whoever, what can I learn? Or how do what could I be wrong? People lose recompetes on business because they're looking at, oh, we've got this handled with the customer. But what if we don't know the customer? What if we're wrong? Again, fear is a good driver within measures to really asking good questions. So how we filter has a lot to do with how successful we are.
That's such a good point. And when you were talking about this, and when you were earlier talking about let's say someone's coming at you and they're 90% in the wrong, and you're only 10% in the wrong. But something I learned in kind of the recovery, oh, sorry, something in my throat, but in the recovery community was keeping your side of the street clean. And so it did help me like change my brain to go, doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what I know. Doesn't matter if someone else is wrong. What can I learn, or what am I responsible for? Right. And that applies to exactly what you're talking about. It's like, I try to do that when who cares about the confirmation? My self-esteem doesn't need confirmation that, oh, I know that. Oh, good. Like, I'm not keeping score. It should
Right.
be, where is the part here that's going to move the needle? Where is the information here that I can extract that's going to make me better, make the company better, that's interesting, that's new, that's exciting? That's where the good stuff is. But, I think with any of us, and I've been on both sides of that coin. I think I've been in the, listening for confirmation versus listening to learn, and it's a lot more fun also, I think, being on the listening to learn thing, being passionately curious, and it's growth versus certainty, I think, when it comes to human needs.
Absolutely. In fact, it reminds me, we developed this exercise some years ago, and it would teach it even to today, that through the result of the exercise, the outcome is it proves to people that they're more likely to be wrong than right on a daily basis. It's not what we say, it's actually what they experience in this exercise. And that's a game changer, because people basically think they're right and could be wrong. But when they take them through this exercise and they realize they're more likely to be wrong than right, what that does is, oh my gosh, I really need to talk to people. I need to go ask them. I need to listen. And it changes the whole team dynamics and ultimately the whole organizational culture by coming from a position that we may be wrong. In fact, the more we realize that we may be wrong, the better our life is because we interact with people differently.
Right.
Now, I've had people challenge me and they'll say, but if I really take that on, I could be insecure. And I say, listen, I want you to be secure, and confident, but come from the facts, not from opinions. Be grounded in your confidence. The reason why I can share and teach and stuff with such great confidence isn't because it's just a bunch of ideas. It's because I've been teaching this and I've seen things that have worked and what hasn't worked and modified it and whatever. And so I have a lot of stories and evidence that supports what we're saying. So my confidence is not driven from the opinions. It's from the factual data of what I've seen that works. And so that's really critical to ground, again, ourselves with the whole fact situation and then really coming from the position that we may be wrong. So we have to interact with each other better. And
Right.
and the other thing that you mentioned, which I just want to seize on, is I often say to people, life is better than we could be wrong. Imagine you're right about everything. Let's say you are right.
Right.
It's kind of boring. I mean, if I'm always right, it's kind of boring. It might be initially kind of fun, but after a while, it's like, I'm not learning, I'm not growing. I love the idea that, hey, I never learned, I didn't know that. Oh, how could I improve that? I love talking to clients and they learn from me, but I learn from them and I'm asking them even before, like, if I can share, even before we jumped on this podcast, I learned from you about the whole recruiting in AI and how challenging and that is because people can misperceive that it's an AI bot or whatever.
Yeah.
And I never really thought about that. And so just realizing what an expert you are and how you can share with people the difference and being able to tell the difference between when a real recruiter versus an AI bot is responding. That's really important. I never even thought about that. I know about AI, but I never thought about that in the recruiting world. And out of that conversation got me thinking, are we making sure that our email responses and everything else, it's coming from us? And I want to make sure that it's not being misperceived as an AI bot. I never really
Right.
thought about that until you brought it up. So we're always learning. So I learned from you already in the conversation, even before the podcast. And so we can learn from everybody. The key is, are we looking for that? Or are we going into transmit mode and just thinking how we're always right? It's fun to be wrong and being open to all kinds of possibilities in life.
I love it. And I think the confidence can or should hopefully come from, oh, I know I'm not going to be right all the time. I don't even know if I'm going to right half the time. But what I do know is we're going to learn and we're keep getting better. So if we're good now, we have the confidence that we're good now, and we know that we got the lights on, like we're open for business, we're going to be progressing. That's where the confidence comes from. It's not like, oh, we're going to crush 10 out of the next 10 big decisions. I know that's not going to happen. If that happens, it means we're probably not making very challenging decisions. You know what I mean? I think innovation in its nature, like when we're doing stuff in our business, I'll get people around, the best people that I can get to think on a particular problem, and then I'll go, all right, yeah, let's. Sometimes we just got to launch it, right? It's just like, well, let's see how it does, man. I think we got a good thing here, but let's check on it again tomorrow and see, and we're gonna have to twist some knobs a little bit and keep improving it. I just think if you're innovating, if you're going to innovate and give birth to different ideas, I think you've got to expect that you've got to raise that child, right? You're going to give birth and then it's not going to be perfect. You've got to, I think, be flexible and be ready for those, I don't want to say failures, but those mistakes that are going to come along the way.
100% agree. In fact, out of what you're saying, we're not saying this word, but I want to bring it up because you talk about speed moving out. Two things I've learned about speed, among many things. Speed motivates people, and speed actually improves quality. Let me first talk about the speed motivates. I've worked with teams that they're moving too slow. It's like we're having conversation about conversation and taking forever to get a product or service out. We've got to get that out, and it actually is exciting. So we've all worked with people that are too slow, and that actually doesn't motivate us. It's like we want to move fast. Now, I don't mean to be not rational and be reckless about this, but I've seen it where we take too long, and so speed motivates people. The second is it improves quality. It's exactly the inverse of how people think. Well, if I slow down, I'll improve quality. Well, to some extent, that may be right. But overall, speed improves quality because here's why. If I'm moving fast and I get a product or service out, again, not being reckless, but I get it out fast, I'm going to learn, which means I get to make changes. I suspect back to SpaceX and Boeing, and I have no evidence for this, so it's an opinion, and I could be way wrong.
Right.
But I imagine they did a lot. SpaceX did a lot of testing and failures and learned more quickly than Boeing. That's what I suspect, and there's probably too many meetings, too much bureaucracy at Boeing that actually prevented things moving fast enough.
Yeah.
So speed, whether we like that or not, example, my point is speed definitely motivates and improves quality. So getting things out, taking risks, we'll learn. And as long as it's not reckless, we're going to learn, we're going to improve, and then we'll outsmart the competition versus another company who's sitting back and having meeting after meeting after evaluating after evaluating after evaluating and never really pulling the trigger and moving forward. Speed motivates and speed improves quality.
Love it. Sorry I took you so far over time. It's been awesome talking with you. Latest book is, I know you have several books out, but Unconditional Power.
Yes.
So you guys can get that. And we'll put links to your book too in the show notes.
Yeah, and I'll just leave you with this. Unconditional power is all about how we're in a good mood, we're smarter. So
Yeah.
how do we get people, how do we get ourselves to stay in a good mood, but how do we get others to stay in a good mood or to be in a good mood so they're smarter and more innovative? And one of the ways is what we're talking about with appreciation and also asking questions and whatnot. So more than happy to help people out. And if they want any advice or anything we can help out, please let us know and give us a call, and we'll try to coach them through that. Also, a reminder, the 13 barriers of innovation, I promise folks of that, all they have to do is go to justbehonest.com, mention your show, and then we'll send it to them. So that's the 13 barriers and the 9-step formula on how to have an honest conversation with anyone. If they mention the show, go to justbehonest.com, send us an email accordingly. We'll send them that, and then they can do whatever they want with the documents.
That's awesome. You've been a great guest. All this stuff is right up my alley, and I've learned a lot from you today. So thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.